And here we are with Romanesque art. Romanesque began its life as a derogatory term. People said, oh, it's a debased form of Roman architecture. Romanesque art and architecture draws from early Christian art, Roman art, and Byzantine art. There are several major cultural aspects of the Romanesque period: the pilgrimages, monasticism, the Crusades, and feudalism. There are several characteristics of Romanesque architecture that you need to be aware of. The arch, or more specifically the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and great walls and pillars that supported these buildings. There are a number of changes in architecture from the medieval period that you can look at in your information page on Romanesque art and architecture. One major thing that takes place in Romanesque architecture is the fact that they began using Roman vaults as opposed to wooden roofs. And these were important for a couple of reasons, this change. The fact that they were fireproof, and that's important for a building lit with candles, and they were acoustically superior. The stone reflected sound as opposed to absorbing it. The Romanesque had long been unable to win, rather like Roman art in this respect. As the Romans were thought to produce poor copies of Greek art, the Romanesque period was considered to be a preceding period of Gothic. Now, both these assessments from the past have been proven through time to be inherently flawed. Now, in Romanesque architecture, we see largely what was a representation of a collective sigh of relief as the millennium, 1000, passed without bringing what was then the feared end of the world. Romanesque architecture takes on many different approaches as it describes buildings in France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. Nevertheless, there is a sort of major distinguishing trademark common to Romanesque buildings, and that's that of large, simple, geometric masses. Now, the basic problems of the Romanesque architect were: 1, looking for a clear and logical articulation of space; 2, the desire for height; 3, the desire for larger buildings, both to accommodate the pilgrims and express the powers of the monastic orders; and 4, they needed to figure out how to support the great vaults, which alleviated fire hazards, yet still provide adequate light to the interior. Now, these problems will be solved in various ways corresponding to the variety of geographical areas that we're going to study. This is the plan and section of St. Philibert, and St. Philibert at Tournus, France, is the most elaborate first Romanesque church that survived. One highly typical Romanesque feature of St. Philibert is the apse with the radiating chapels that you see in the plan in the upper right section of your slide. Also typically Romanesque, but not seen in the section view, was the presence of a tower at St. Philibert. The most remarkable, however, is the great variety of vaulting techniques that were employed here. It seems an elaborate experiment in vaulting, as virtually every known vaulting system, except for the dome, was employed here. Nothing quite like it was ever built again, and the great variety of vaults probably have much to do with the fact that this church was built and rebuilt over a period covering 170 years. Now, also of great significance is the presence in this church of an ambulatory, as seen in the plan, and that allowed for early circulation, or easy circulation, excuse me. This is the interior of St. Philibert in Tournus, France, dating from around 950 to 1020 primarily, but also worked on much later than that. What you see here are groin, barrel, and quadrant vaults used in St. Philibert. A quadrant vault is a half barrel vault used to cover the flank aisles and buttress the nave. Now we have employed here what are called transverse barrel vaults, and they were used to cover the main church. As opposed to using a single longitudinal barrel vault, which would require massive side walls for buttressing, 5 smaller transverse barrels were run across the nave rather than the length of the nave, and they buttressed each other and required a great deal less support. The end walls in this church perform no great supporting function and can thus be open to windows, and that helps solve lighting problems here. Now contrast what we see here with St. Philibert with what we find in the next. This is St. Cernan in Toulouse, France, from around 1080 to 1120. Now St. Cernan, on the other hand, uses the single longitudinal barrel vault. Now while this church is a highly developed example of the square schematism, the idea of building through modules to provide cohesiveness, the church nevertheless illustrates the major vaulting problem, that of letting light in. Let's see what that looks like in the interior in the next slide. Okay, this is the nave and choir from St. Cernan. Now this simple longitudinal vault, it may seem to be the ideal form for this design. It's poor in terms of its function. This is Speyer Cathedral in Germany, begun around 1030. Now while it's similar in plan to St. Cernan, it differs in its multitude of towers that we see here from the east end. This is beginning to anticipate what's going to happen with Gothic architecture. This slide shows us a reconstruction of the original nave of Speyer Cathedral. And you see that initially this was a timber roof structure. And this allowed for easy cutting through of windows. Lots of light inside because the roof did not weigh a whole lot, so you could open up the side walls. On replacing the roof, they had to deal with pre-existing buttressing support walls. And here is the interior of Speyer Cathedral. The solution then was a groin vault of cut stones joined by mortar. This made for less flank weight than a barrel vault. And then they added and implemented what's called the alternate support system. And this offset the additional roof weight brought on by the vaulting. And if you look at the side walls of the church and compare them to the previous slide, where we had the reconstruction of what the original nave looked like, you can easily identify the way the pillars, so to speak, have been used to implement the alternate support system. The similarities in vaulting and the use of the square schematism indicate the close political ties between Lombardy, which is northern Italy, and Germany. A favorite argument, perhaps the first argument of historians, is the chicken and the egg. The answer here doesn't matter, as we have both now, as evidenced by these churches. This is St. Ambrogio in Milan from the late 11th and 12th centuries. St. Ambrogio is an unusual church in terms of its overall design, vaults, and buttressing. Apparently this was one of the last churches with an atrium to be built, and you see the atrium projecting forward from the church. Now what visual effect does the atrium have? To me it seems a rather heavy appendage. Perhaps the inability to fully integrate the form into the overall design of the church led to its demise. The differences in the tower designs point out that they were constructed at different times. The shorter tower was followed by the latter. Now they also differ in terms of ornament, with both featuring pilasters and shafting, those are the vertical dividing forms, and corbel tables, those are your horizontal dividing forms. Now both these pilasters and corbel tables were typical features of Lombard towers. Now, does anything bother you about this arrangement of towers? I think a lot of people would be put off by the lack of symmetry. You might propose a different solution. You might propose that when they built the second tower, they'd make it exactly the same as the first. What's the explanation for this change? In an age of great innovations in building, it would have been impossible to step backward merely for continuity. This is like the child with the old toy and the new toy. Which do they play with? The new toy. The taller tower, that's the new toy here. This is a plan of San Ambrogio, and the interior is divided into 3 large bays with groin vaults, as seen in this plan. This is Saint Etienne in Cayenne, France, the west facade, begun around 1068. In design, Saint Etienne here anticipates 2 tower facades of Gothic churches to follow that we've already mentioned a little bit. There are many similarities between this design and that of the works in the following chapter. 4 large buttresses denote what's called a tripartite division in this structure, and that tripartite division exists both horizontally and vertically. Now, while this is nowhere near as ornate as its Gothic counterparts, we see the seeds of design being laid down at this point. This is the interior of Saint Etienne. It was vaulted around 1115 to 1120. The alternating support system here can be seen as half columns alternating with shafts attached to pilasters. These help support one of the earliest true rib vaults, in which diagonal and transverse ribs make up a structure which in itself carries some of the weight of the vault. This type of vault was very effective in opening the exterior to a clerestory, and that allowed in turn for better light. This is Durham Cathedral, the nave looking east in England, dating from 1093 to 1130. The Durham Cathedral carries rib vaulting and the alternate support system closer to its inevitable conclusion. Now, these processes were used for what purpose? To open the building up more and to cause the building to depend on a skeletal framework for structural integrity that would in turn allow for better lighting. The rib vaults and slightly pointed arches seen in the western part of the nave are features of early Gothic architecture. However, the irregularity of the division of the rib vaults, with 7 panels caused by diagonals springing from compound piers, and the massive construction make this church Romanesque. Now, the pillars are unique among Romanesque architecture in their ornamentation, which features abstract designs carried from migration period artists and their metalwork. Look at the pillars, particularly that you can see on the right side, and you'll see that the patterns used here include the diamond, the chevron, and the cable. This is the Pisa Cathedral group. What we have is the baptistry, the cathedral, and the campanile, dating from 1053 to 1272. And the Pisa Cathedral group was the work of the Greek architect Busquetos. Southern Italy was possibly less given to following the Romanesque ideas of the mainland, as this group looks very different from what we've seen thus far. Now, Tuscany followed ancient traditions. We see the early Christian basilica design in terms of the transept. We see classical columns. There's a Byzantine gallery. And we also see the influence of Islamic architecture by the interior decoration and the occasional use of the pointed arch. Now, not all Romanesque architecture concerned itself with vaulting, as a timber roof was used in Pisa Cathedral. Now, Tuscan Romanesque architecture is most characterized by its outer decorative qualities. Compare the west end of the cathedral with St. Etienne, or even the exterior of Spire Cathedral. Pisa's exterior no doubt foretells the coming exterior revolution in Gothic architecture. The Leaning Tower, which we all know, is but a part of the complex. I find that it's a little like Leonardo's Last Supper, admired in spite of, or possibly because of, its flaw. It is 21 feet out of plumb and started to tilt during its construction due to a poor foundation. This is San Miniato al Monte in Florence, Italy, from 1062 and also the 12th century. And San Miniato al Monte is another Tuscan church which recalls early Christian architecture and layout, yet presents an elaborate exterior facade in white and dark green marble.